Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anil Deolalikar, founding dean of UCR School of Public Policy. Is this working? Yes. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's installment of our regular public policy seminar series. It is also my great honor to welcome back to our campus our distinguished guest speaker today, who is a UCR alumnus and who's also the current California State Assembly member representing the 40th District, Marc Steinorth. Thank you for joining us today, Assemblymember Steinorth. But before I bring our guest speaker up, I'd like to first go over the format of this seminar. We will reserve the first 45 minutes to an hour for our guest speaker's presentation. Then we will leave some time in the end for questions and answers. I ask our audience members to please write your questions on the index cards you should have received upon your entry into this venue. During the Q&A, you can submit your index cards to one of our student ambassadors who will be on either side of this room. I would also like to take this opportunity to remind everyone of UCR's principles of community. At our university, we strive for mutual respect among our guests, audience, and community members, and we work to make sure that our campus is a safe and welcoming environment for everyone. We value freedom of speech, and we also set the example for being respectful of others, regardless of differences in opinion. We understand that just because we might disagree with someone and someone's point of view, it does not mean that they are less deserving of our respect, courtesy, and professionalism. So let's please all engage in a civil discourse and maintain communication that aligns with UCR's principles of community. Thank you all for being exemplars of mutual respect throughout today's event. I would also like to reiterate that this is not a campaign event. Today's seminar is part of our School of Public Policy seminar series, and through this long-standing series, we have invited over the years various policymakers, elected legislators, policy practitioners, and policy researchers from both sides of the aisle to discuss some of the big challenges facing our communities today. We are excited to have Assemblymember Steinorth here today to talk about his experiences in the state legislature, the legislative process, as well as California policymaking in general. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce our guest. Another minute. Assemblymember Marc Steinorth was elected to the California State Legislature in 2014 and got re-elected in 2016 to represent the 40th Assembly District. He is an entrepreneur, small business owner, and former Rancho Cucamonga City Council member. He grew up in San Bernardino as the son of an Air Force officer stationed at Norton Air Force Base. Upon graduating from UCR, he moved to Rancho Cucamonga, where he lives with his two children, Madison and Mason. Assemblymember Steinorth previously served as the vice chair of the Assembly Committee on Housing and Community Development, as well as the Business and Professions, Health, and Governmental Organization committees. We are delighted to have him here at UCR today. Please join me in giving Assemblymember Steinorth a warm welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, thanks first. Do you want me to turn this mic on now? I've got a little, they gave me a little portable mic. I'm going to turn this on this way. I'm untethered from the, there we go. I'm going to be untethered from the, how's that work? Is that too much? Is that okay? All right, well first, I just want to say thank you. That was a great introduction, and I just want to give you a little bit of my background, if you don't mind. We were having some conversations before we came in, and kind of a regular occurrence of some of the questions. I grew up as a military brat. So a military brat means that I had the thrill and enjoyment of moving every 3 years of my life to follow my father when he was stationed from Air Force Base to Air Force Base. And we were brought here to California in 1980. I was born in Sacramento, but we came back to the San Bernardino area at Norton Air Force Base in 1980. I was 10 years old at the time. I went through elementary school, junior high, began my high school here, and then my father was transferred to Germany. So I finished out my high school in my first year of college in West Germany, back before the wall fell, and enjoyed the thrill of Munich and all the experiences that you could have. I mentioned earlier my parents were very ambitious for my brother and I. They were like, here's a passport, here's a credit card, don't end up in jail. I thought it was a good way to enjoy Europe, and it was very safe for us back then. It was a lot of fun, so we were able to experience a lot. And then when I came back to California, it was interesting. I was able to vote in California. My parents owned a home in California, but when I came here, I wasn't considered a California resident. So I did 1 year at a community college so that I could reach my residency, and then I transferred here to UC Riverside, and I finished my bachelor's degree in political science. And it was funny, I remember it was Pi Sigma Alpha was for the honors fraternity for political science. They had a dinner for everybody that was graduating, and they had us all come up and kind of stand in line and get up, and it was one of my first times ever standing behind a podium and doing public speaking. Scared me to death. And everybody had to talk about, well, what were they going to do next? And so, of course, the first person comes up, and they're going to this master's program. The next one was going to this law school, and on and on and on, until it became my time. And I got up there, and I said, I'm getting a job. I'm going to go out there, and I'm going to pay for this college, and I'm going to move on. I'm going to find gainful employment. I'm going to be successful. I'm going to be a business person. And it was unusual because no one else had done that. It was right after the '92 election where Ross Perot ran against Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, and he got 15% of the popular vote. We hadn't seen that out of a third-party candidate since the Bull Moose Party, and that was something impressive. So I went out and I got a job, and I've been in the private sector for over 25, 26 years, and when I turned 40, I said, you know what, I think it's about time that I started giving back, because coming from a military background, you believe in community service. You believe in giving back to the community that's given you so much. And I really just love California. I was born here. I made it my home by choice because I could have lived any of the places that my parents had taken me throughout my childhood. And so, everybody that's in elected office, the question that I think you should ask is, what was the one thing that compelled you to go out and actually put your name on a ballot and see if the voters would accept and be willing to listen to your ideas? And it starts out with the weirdest answers. For me, it was a speed bump. I mean, literally. I had a speed bump in my neighborhood, which compelled me to go to an HOA meeting. The HOA meeting had a vacancy. By the time I left the HOA meeting, I was now a member of the board, which was kind of crazy. And as a member of the board, it's now incumbent upon me to do better for that community. So I delved into that, and I worked to be able to make it a really great, safe neighborhood. And then that rolled me into a run for city council in Rancho Cucamonga, which was the adopted home that I have now. And it was strictly my private sector business experience I felt would lend itself well to that city. And Rancho Cucamonga is a unique city. It was formed in 1977, and the current treasurer was the first mayor, and he's been in elected office the entire time. So it's a very insular city, and coming as an outsider saying, hey, I want to be on city council, that's not an easy feat to do. But my private sector experience is I own an advertising agency. So advertising kind of works hand in hand with politics. So I went out and I marketed myself as the product. And I have to tell you, as an elected official, when you have to make that distance between you being an individual and you being a product, being your brand that's out there as far as your name, it's kind of a strange, surreal experience when you see signs with what is your name but now represents something to other people. But so I was on city council, and I was trying to help. It was right in the tail end of the economic recovery, and we still had a lot of businesses that needed to fill those empty buildings and bring the vacancy rates up and start being successful as retailers. So I created just a private sector concept that anybody that lives in Rancho Cucamonga that drives to other counties for employment, when it makes sense for those to advocate to their current employers, why not relocate your business to Rancho Cucamonga? We'll greet you with open arms, and then we will have a process by which we can help you move your business and your employees here. And it worked. It worked really successfully, and we were able to bring a lot of businesses and bring the economic tax base of Rancho Cucamonga up, and that was popular, and I was very proud of the efforts we did. And then our current senator, Bill Emerson, a very respected senator, decided that, you know what, it was time for him to retire. And so he left a vacancy on the Senate side. Our current Assemblymember Mike Morrell decided, you know, hey, I've always wanted to be in the Senate, ran for that spot, left a vacancy in the Assembly, and I was compelled to run for that. Now, when I was asked originally, I promise you I said no. I was like, no, the idea of flying up to Sacramento 9 months of the year, every single week, and sleeping in a hotel, living out of a suitcase, no. I really enjoy living in my own room, you know, sleeping in my own bed and enjoying the company of my 2 children. I'd rather do that. But it was impressed upon me of the necessity of having a business voice in the state of California. And I agree. There is a need for us to have differences of opinion without necessarily being in conflict with each other. And that's what I would like to talk to you about today is some of that. So ultimately, I ran in 2014, and as the dean mentioned, I was successful in that election. And I decided to hit the ground running as quickly as I can and learn specific issue areas. There are only 80 assembly members in the state of California. We represent nearly 40 million people, so it's about 500,000 people for each assembly member. So I represent currently the cities of Rancho Cucamonga, Redlands, Highland, Loma Linda, San Bernardino, Devore, Lytle Creek, and Mentone. That's a huge, if you saw that on a map, it is this weird, oddly shaped horseshoe that just kind of shapes around another assembly member's district. And it's a unique space. It's something that I know very well, and it's home to me. Highland is where I started my first pizza place. I built a small chain of pizza places while I've been doing the advertising agency. And Rancho is where I had another pizza place. So for me, the east side of the county and the west side of the county was very comfortable. And I was able to go in and actually represent myself in those areas. But in Sacramento, every single thing that goes on in your life is impacted, or what's decided there has an impact on you. And so the dean mentioned the committees that I serve on. When we speak about the health committee, pretty much everything that we deal with, there's going to be legislation that comes through the health committee. The committee on housing and the committee on housing and community development, I'm going to talk a little bit about housing policy and how that really makes a difference in your lives, because we want you to purchase a home and to invest in California. Government organization, we just recently had Proposition 64 pass. Today is what day? Well, that goes through that committee. And yes, and also alcohol, tobacco, firearms, any casinos, any gaming in California, the card rooms, the racetracks, the tribal lands, all of that is managed by the Government Organization Committee, as well as oversight on the government itself. Business and professions, anybody that has a license to do business in California, whatever that license is, Business and Professions Committee. So you take those committees together and you realize, wow, that's a whole lot of policy issues that you have to become an expert at. And they use the analogy, it's like drinking out of a fire hose. Legitimately, it is. It's true. What will happen when you're first elected is you'll spend the first 3 to 4 months in about 10 to 15 minute increments, meeting almost every representative from almost every issue area and industry throughout California, coming in and giving you a very quick snapshot on what their key care-abouts are, who they are, and how they operate in California. And they give you about 5 minutes in between these meetings to use the bathroom if you're lucky, right? And you have to go up and down the stairs, run around the area. Literally, I lost 27 pounds the first year on the job because you skip meals, you have meeting after meeting, and you're running up and down stairs. So it's a bit of chaos. They say, well, why not use the elevator? Well, that's like a petri dish. Everybody in the world that's sick is in the elevator. If you want to get any type of, anything, you get in that elevator. You want to avoid it, take the stairs. Just a little heads up for when you guys do lobby day in Sacramento. Take the stairs. What I want to talk to you about today, if you don't mind, is housing. A couple different things that I've been able to really advocate for and talk about how bipartisanship and working across the aisle. They use that phrase on a regular basis coming out of the federal government. In California, I think it's absolutely necessary for us to discuss as well. But let me first put the framework out there. When we speak about federal policy, do you know how many bills Congress really debates and passes any given year? Maybe 10? 15? I mean, do you think it's more than 15? Anybody? I mean, when we listen to MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, are there any real issues that you're hearing about besides maybe 5, 10, 15 different policies? My first year in Sacramento, I voted on over 2,400 bills. 2,400. This year, there are 4,500 pieces of legislation that were introduced. That's insane. That's insane. Just put that into perspective. We hear on the national news about what's going on in the federal government. We are not hearing on the national news or even in our local news about what's going on in the state government, but yet our state is shaping everything that goes on in your life. And that's consequential. It's something that I hope everybody has a chance to really do a deep dive and pay attention to websites like Rough and Tumble, where it's kind of an aggregate site that will pull different articles from the LA Times, the Sacramento Bee, and make yourself well-versed on what's going on in Sacramento, because Sacramento is paying very close attention to you. But when it comes to housing in the state of California, most of you young people are going to have a very hard time right now purchasing a home, just because the median cost of a house is nearly $500,000 in the Inland Empire. Now, I have the privilege and honor right now as serving as the chairman of the Inland Empire Caucus. Effectively, it's comprised of every assembly member and every senator, both Republicans and Democrats alike, that are hosted and housed in Riverside and San Bernardino counties. So that's one of the roles that I have. And we've been working diligently on how do we work within the Inland Empire so that we have one voice. One voice. Because political parties, unfortunately, in my opinion, are there to divide us. And, you know, folks, I'm not a Crip member, you're not a Blood, we're not gang members. Republicans and Democrats, we have more in common than we do that divides us. I'd say we probably have about 85% of any issue we really share commonality. It's the 15% of those kind of like, you know, far left or far right issues that we will probably differ on. But if we can concentrate on being, you know, really coalescing around those 85% issues, we're going to have a really good time and we'll work together really well. Well, one of the issues that I think we all need to work on is private property ownership. I believe that every single person that has an opportunity to purchase their first home is making the best step forward towards reaching middle-class prosperity. Private property rights is one of the foundations of which our country was founded. Why? Because it gives us that opportunity for us to seek and achieve and realize the American dream. You're investing in yourself when you pay for your mortgage, as opposed to investing in someone else's asset when you pay for rent. And we have the ability for each and every one of us to save money and invest into property. Now, I have introduced and have spearheaded what I call the homeownership savings account. It's a concept that's very simple. Hopefully your parents and some of your family members were able to save into a 529 college savings account to help you pay for school. It allows you to save up to $10,000 per year after-tax dollars going into a savings vehicle, allows you to use that towards your college, and it makes sense. You don't pay taxes when the money is withdrawn. So I borrowed that framework to incentivize young people to purchase a home. The idea is you're allowed to save up to $10,000 per year per person into a savings vehicle, allow it to go in tax-free, allow you to use that savings vehicle to invest in mutual funds, into stocks, appreciate, you know, whatever you feel is worthwhile. If you're comfortable, put it in a CD of deposit. It's not a big interest return there, but it's safe. And allow you to withdraw that money tax-free as long as you use it towards its intended purpose, the down payment, closing costs, inspection fees of your first-time home purchase. It's kind of cool. I've introduced this legislation 3 years in a row, and I've been very successful in moving the goalpost each year as it works its way through the legislative process. So let me stop for a moment and explain a little bit about the legislative process. So for every piece of legislation, let's say I have a great idea. I want to create the home ownership savings account. I sit down with the attorneys in the legislature and I draft out exactly what my idea is. Working with the attorneys, the legislative attorney's office, we will actually create that into a bill, into policy. I will then introduce that bill into the Assembly, and then it will go to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee will define which committees will hear this bill. How will they decide if it's successful or not? And then my job is to take that bill and to go each one of these committees and present it. Now, for example, homeownership savings account, you would think, hey, that would go to housing, right? That makes sense. So the first committee I would go in would be housing. Now, I have to know every single member in the housing committee. I'm going to make you front row my housing committee members, okay? You good with that? Okay, I am going to get to know you really well. I'm going to get to know the three of you really well, and I'm going to sell you the idea of why homeownership savings accounts make a difference in the districts that you represent. And then I'm going to reach out to realtors, and I'm going to reach out to young people in your districts, and I'm going to encourage them to reach out to you and tell you why the homeownership savings account is a great idea. And I'm going to do that before I go to your committee, because I need to know before I go into your committee how you're going to vote. Otherwise, it would be malpractice on my part to present my bill to you and have you vote no, because I don't want that. We want you to be successful. We want me to be successful. We want the bill to be successful. So I'm going to have a conversation with each of you, and we're going to decide what makes sense. And if you have ideas for my bill, I'll take those on as amendments, because we want to make it more successful together. After I go to your committee and you all vote yes, thank you very much for voting yes. I really appreciate that. It was very kind of you and very generous. I will then move on to the next committee. And I'm going to dub this next section where now you're in the Revenue and Taxation Committee, because we're dealing with taxes, because we're making it a tax-free issue. So I'm going to do the same process here, and I'm going to make sure that I receive all of your votes and I'm able to move that bill. And if it's successful, it'll move on to the Appropriations Committee. And if I'm very successful and I can move it out of Appropriations, now I can take it to the floor of the Assembly. And it's pretty cool. I go to the Assembly, I'm at my desk, and I lift up my microphone and I speak, Madam Speaker, I'd like to represent, my bill, the homeownership savings account, and I sell you why the homeownership savings account makes sense. And then I ask you to vote yes. And then based on my relationships with you and whether I have been successful in selling the homeownership savings account, you will decide whether that's going to be approved or not. If it is approved, then my bill moves off the floor of the Assembly, moves to the Rules Committee on the Senate side, and the whole process starts all over again. Fun. So I work through all of those committees again, but this time I can't present the bill on the floor of the Senate because I'm not a senator. So I need to say, Dean, you're a senator. So I would like you to please be my floor jockey, and I would like you to please represent my bill on your floor, and then you'll ask me in return for a bill that you have that might be in the Assembly for me to represent your bill in the Assembly. And then his job is to go and make sure that everyone will vote for my bill. After it is successful in the Senate, you did a great job. Thank you very much for all your hard work. Then it'll go before the governor. Now the question is, will the governor sign the bill or not? That is like reading tea leaves, because you never know which way the governor is going to go. And this governor has been very closed-mouthed, and it's hard for us to get a clear understanding of sometimes what his priorities are. But when he has a priority, man, he makes that clear. But when we don't know what his priority is, our job is to try and advocate on really why it makes sense for our legislation and go and sell it. Now, for the first 2 years that I introduced my homeownership savings account, my bill made it to appropriations, but the cost on the bill was exceedingly high to the state of California. So it was unsuccessful coming out of the Appropriations Committee. This year, I worked across the aisle with a good representative, good friend of mine, Assemblymember Rob Bonta, who represents San Francisco. Now, the Inland Empire and San Francisco are completely opposite when we look at about our housing needs. I mean, think about it. San Francisco, there's really not single-family dwelling units. You have a lot of multifamily dwelling units. If it's single family, they're probably pretty old, and they're in some very historic areas of San Francisco, very hard for somebody to save money to purchase those. So trying to come up with compromise legislation that my good friend Rob Bonta and myself can work together really brings both ends of California to be a team. And that's what makes sense, because if you think about it, California, we're either the 5th or the 6th largest economy in the world, depending on how France is doing, really. I mean, France is the one that kind of is in a duel with us over who's in 5th, 6th place. But we're a very diverse state. Policies that make sense here in the Inland Empire don't always make sense in San Francisco, because it's just a different dynamic. Different people, different demographics, different care abouts, different needs, different income levels, all of that. But what we all understand right now is that we're in a bit of a housing crisis, and we understand that we have about 1.5 million units short of homes just to keep up with the population that's in California at this very moment, not taking into consideration any of our population growth. In the Inland Empire alone, they estimate right now we're at about 4.5 million people. In the next 15 years, they expect our population to double. Double. Now think about that in terms of housing. Imagine where you are right now with the rents that you're paying and the difficulties it was to find a place that you could rent. Imagine when there are twice as many people vying for the same amount of inventory. The prices are all going to go through the roof. How do we stop the prices from going through the roof? Increase supply. The way that we change the dynamic is we build more homes. We build more apartments. We build more condos. We build more of everything that people choose for their own lifestyle and where they would like to live. And we build them in areas where people are willing to drive, people are wanting to live, people wish that their employment, everything like that works together. And we have to come up with policies to make sense. The homeownership savings account is a way for me to help your demographic, your age group, save enough money that when you're at that age where you're ready to purchase a home, you have money down for a down payment. You have money saved, so when it's time for you to purchase, you're able to actually compete with other people that are coming out of their first home and moving into possibly their second. And we want to actually incentivize developers to build more of the first homes, and we want to be able to incentivize people that are living in larger homes to maybe move to the home that meets their needs by allowing them to move their property tax base with them. So I'm going to move on to the next topic. Homeownership is one of those unique opportunities for us because we have a thing called Proposition 13. Now, are you guys familiar with Prop 13? I know the dean is. Anybody that owns a home right now is familiar. In 1978, Proposition 13 was passed by the ballot initiative and signed into law by then Governor Brown, who is the same Governor Brown we have now. He was our youngest governor then. He is our oldest governor now, which is kind of fascinating. So what Proposition 13 does is it says anybody that owns a piece of property will not have their property taxes increased by more than up to 2% per year. That's it. Now, there can be bonds and other issues that can be put onto the property taxes, but for the most part, your property taxes can remain very constant, so it allows you as a homeowner to have a clear understanding of what your expectations are for paying Uncle Sam, or in this case, the state of California. And we want to make sure that our parents and our grandparents are not priced out of the housing market to the point where if they reassess the property value, the taxes based on the current property value, you could see a lot of people that have lived in California for 30 plus years no longer able to afford the taxes alone. And that was the reason why that was put into place. You're going to have a chance to vote, I believe it's in November, on a ballot proposal to allow transfer of your base property tax with Proposition 13 for anybody over the age of 55 an unlimited amount of times. Meaning you've lived in your home for 30 years, you had a nice 4-bedroom house, your children have moved on, they've gone to college, they have families of their own. Wouldn't it make sense for you to move to something that really fits your lifestyle more? Maybe in a more urban community, something where you can walk and enjoy the outdoors and have parks and recreation and shopping within a reasonable distance, and allow a family that's maybe just having more children, they're growing into, maybe they have 2 children, 3 children, to be able to purchase your home. Right now, you're stuck because your property tax base is based on a lower amount. So for you to move that with you, that would incentivize you to release that inventory for the young family to be able to move in and allow that housing stock to transfer around so that we don't have it stick with one family the entire time. So those are just a couple of the simple proposals that we're trying to do in the housing arena. But then when we look at what's going on in San Francisco, completely different scenario. There, what we've worked on is legislation to allow development of affordable housing, market rate housing, all of the above style housing near transit sites where people can go ahead and get onto a light rail, get onto a metro, get onto a bus, or anywhere that a train that will take them to where their place of employment is, and they may not need to purchase a car. By building housing near transit, we may not need to have as many parking spaces for as many units as we put into that space. So trying to come up with legislation that makes sense here, where all of us own cars, is going to be a little bit different than what we do in San Francisco, where people choose not to have they may choose to use public transportation instead of private transportation. And that's just how it makes sense for us. So those are just two big policy topics: home ownership and the Prop 13 transfer. I'm going to ask for questions, and then I'm going to go on to next topics. Anybody have any questions about housing so far? Anyone?
Why don't we collect all the questions later?
All right, very good. Fair enough. All right. So one of the debates that's going on right now in Sacramento, and I think we've heard this a bit, is about rent control. Now, we know that the cost of housing has gone up dramatically, just as I described. So one of the proposals that's coming out of the San Francisco area as well is to try and create rent control throughout the state of California. Now, there's a bill, the Costa-Hawkins Act was put into place in 1995, and that actually curbed the expansion of rent control. And let me explain to you why I'm concerned about what rent control does and how it will actually hurt the development and the construction of new homes. The way it's structured right now with rent control is if you have a building that was built before 1995 in very urban communities, and it's a multifamily dwelling unit, if that city has designated that that property is available for rent control, then you have an opportunity to compete and try and get that space. Now, it's not means tested, so somebody that's making $1 million a year or somebody that's making minimum wage have an equal opportunity to try and compete for that rent control space. If they're successful in getting rent control, then a lot of times you'll find that person will hold on to that apartment or dwelling unit for a very long period of time, and that takes that inventory out of the market for anyone else that's looking to live there. The challenge that I have about expansion of rent control throughout the entirety of California is if we eliminate the Costa-Hawkins Act, we would actually open it up to single-family dwelling units as well. So a lot of your families may actually have a rental property that they use for additional income to supplement, what they make from their jobs. When the housing prices were low, maybe they purchased a home and they go ahead and have a rental in it. One of the greatest concerns when you're dealing with property rights is whether you get to control the value of that property or not. If you allow the government to take over and apply rent control, you no longer have control over that property, and subsequently the cost of the housing that are not rent control will continue to rise, while yours that is rent control will not, and you will lose a tremendous amount of equity, and that's a concern that I have. The repeal of Costa-Hawkins would also then apply to single-family dwelling units. Never happened before. It's a great concern of mine as well, because I don't want to throw a giant cold shower on the development community. We want to incentivize them to go out and take the risk and the gamble so that they can go ahead and develop more homes. So where is the risk and gamble for developers when they're building homes? Well, back when Ronald Reagan was governor, he signed into law the California Environmental Quality Act. We refer to it quickly as CEQA. C-E-Q-A. I don't understand why it's got a U in it in the way we say it, CEQA. It should be CEQA, but it's not. It's CEQA. Basically, the California Environmental Quality Act it started out as a really laudable concept. The idea is if you look up at the hills behind us and you see how pristine and beautiful they are, or you see these large swaths of land that have yet to be developed, and you're looking and you're saying, gosh, that's beautiful. Think of all the native animals, creatures, the habitat itself. If we're going to go and develop and tear up that ground and repurpose it for development, wouldn't it make sense for have a clear understanding of who else is living there? So going through an environmental review process was established with this legislation so that we could look and see, is it a good decision or is it a bad decision? Unfortunately, what's happened with this policy, as with all, unfortunately, in my opinion, a lot of government policies, is over time, they become something different than what they were originally intended for. And so now, if you're a developer, I'm going to make you a developer, Dean. The Dean is going to develop about 400 units of single-family homes. And unfortunately, my friend Alexis just doesn't like that. Alexis, with only $5,000, can actually sue the dean and his project and stop it in the court system for about a 2 to 3 year period before the dean can go through the whole process. Now, the cost for the dean to build those 400 units now has just quintupled. So what was originally a great idea, where the dean could walk away and say, hey, you know what, I can sell the house for this price, and I have this much in profit that will roll into the next project, he's spending all of those resources now in lawyers' fees trying to get through the environmental review process that Alexis is able to stop with just $5,000. So what happens is the dean's competitors, who don't really like the fact that you are building those 400 units, they're now using that same CEQA process to stop the dean. Now we have other groups that maybe, I don't want that in my backyard. NIMBYs, another acronym, not in my backyard. They may not like that development because they're concerned. You know what, this road, I'm used to driving with not a lot of traffic. If I build 400 units, I may have to put a stoplight there. I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the dean with the CEQA process. Hence, we're 1.5 million units short of where we need to be in California. We need to streamline and correct the CEQA process so that we can still protect the environment, protect against pollution, save the native species of the area, but in a circumstance where we don't have those in that area, the dean should be allowed to have the opportunity to go ahead and build his 400 units. And if he can build them at the best price possible, now we have more available space, and it's at a greater cost, a lower cost to you because it's more affordable. And now you actually can afford to purchase in the area, and you'll be able to not have to drive 3 hours to be able to find housing that makes sense for you financially. So trying to reform CEQA has been one of the biggest issues that I've seen the legislature try to tackle in the last 10 years. And it's one of those hot button topics where it's kind of, you know, people on the very far left and on the very far right, they just can't seem to come up with what is that reasonable compromise. Unless you're a billionaire trying to build a new sports stadium, it doesn't seem like anybody is looking for CEQA exemptions to allow the dean to go ahead and build those 400 units. So unfortunately, we have a little bit more work to do there in the process. Now, I've talked a little bit about housing. I'm going to transition to something on a little softer side, okay? Anybody here animal fans? Anybody have pets? There we go, okay. So I am an absolute enthusiastic animal lover. I've been an animal lover since I was a young boy. My parents have always trained working dogs. They'll puppy raise them, and then they'll go off to university, and if they're unsuccessful in university, they come back, and my parents will then work with the working dogs again, so that you can see a lot of the people that have disabilities, they have the dogs that will assist them. So I have grown up in an environment where I am always surrounded by four-legged family members, and in fact, in my parents' home, they have portraits of their dogs, and my children are in the small little pictures on the side, and the big portraits are of their pets. So I don't know, is anybody familiar with that bill that went into law last year that allows you the ability to have Good Samaritan protection, both legal and civil, if you rescue an animal trapped inside of a hot car? Have you heard of that one? Well, that was one of my pieces of legislation I'm really proud of. It's called the Right to Rescue Act. It's kind of a simple concept. It's very hot where we live, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people like to go on little trips with their pets, and they think, you know what, I'm going to stop at the drugstore real quick, and I'm going to go inside and just pick up something super quick. I'm going to crack the window. I'm going to leave Fido in the car, and then I'm going to go in. I'll be right back out. No harm, no foul. I'm sorry. It doesn't work that way. Myself and two of my colleagues took the liberty of locking ourselves in a hot car for 21 minutes. I think it was only 89 degrees outside. Within that 21 minutes, it rose to 108 degrees inside that car, and we videotaped the whole thing. You can see it on YouTube. If you just say, you know, Hot Car Challenge, Marc Steinorth, you'll see us in there just pouring sweat. I mean, just gushing sweat and almost getting giddy and silly at the end because we were just, I mean, when you lock yourself inside of a hot car like that, it can actually hurt us. Now, we have the opportunity to sweat. Animals don't. They don't have sweat glands. They will pant, but they can't actually sweat outside of that fur coat. So within a few minutes, their organs will actually start to shut down. And in a shorter period of time, they will go into full shock and then ultimately die. And that happens way too regularly. A lot of it is not reported because it's unnecessary. It's not required to report. We do rescue children that are trapped inside of a hot car. Those numbers are reported. But for the animals, not as much. So I introduced the legislation, did the gimmicky video, put it out there, and sold the idea to our colleagues. And ultimately, Governor Brown signed it into law. And I'm proud to say, in the last 2 summers that we've had, on social media, I've seen at least a dozen incidents where people have actually opened the car door, rescued the animal, and been able to save their lives. Now, before you go out and break a window, let me give you kind of the rules on how it works. One, you have to have a true belief that that animal is in imminent danger of death. Okay, so you got to make sure that the animal is actually going to die. You believe that, you have a good faith belief that if you do not rescue that animal will not survive the next 5 or 10 minutes. You need to call law enforcement and ask, hey, Marc Steinorth here, I'm next to a car, it's hot, it's 102 degrees outside, the dog is inside here, and I'm at this parking lot, what is your ETA? And law enforcement will say, we're about 15 minutes away. I just don't think that this dog is going to survive for those 15 minutes. Okay, move on to step number 3. Check the door. Make sure that it's not unlocked, because I want to use as minimal force as necessary. Step 4, look to see if I can find the actual owner of the vehicle. Hey, does anybody know whose car this is? Do you know whose animal this is? Step 5, after I've gone through and I've rescued the animal, I stay at a safe distance in a safe space, and I wait until law enforcement arrives. If you have completed all 5 of those steps, you will have civil and legal Good Samaritan protection against any issues that would come out of you rescuing that animal. So I would encourage all of you to do that. And then as an animal lover, I have sponsored an adoption fair for the last 4 years where we have paid for the adoption fees of nearly 700 animals out of local shelters. And I've introduced legislation unsuccessfully because it's a tax credit where you're allowed to take a $100 tax credit for anybody that chooses to adopt as opposed to purchase an animal from a store. Now, that is a warm and fuzzy bill because who wouldn't rather adopt than purchase? It makes sense, right? But it's also good public policy because local governments spend about $133 million a year maintaining shelters. Wouldn't it make sense that if we incentivize more people to adopt shelters, that $133 million will start to decrease, and the dollars being spent there could be better used towards more law enforcement, towards fixing roads, towards whatever type of economic development prospects they can do to bring more businesses, or they can go towards helping to incentivize home ownership in their local areas. So it's one of those kind of like good feel bills, but also has a lot of other secondary and tertiary benefits that would be able to help government in general. Now, I wanted to talk to you about those 2 issues, and I wanted to give enough time to answer any questions that anyone might have. So with that, I'd like to offer the opportunity for the Dean and I to have a conversation. Now, just so anyone wants to turn in questions, I'm blunt, I'm raw, I won't hide from any of the answers, and I will tell you if I don't know the answer straight away. So if I don't know it, I'll just say I don't know it. But be prepared, I'll shoot from the hip. I think you should still be on, because every time I get near there, I get feedback.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation about how the legislative process works.
Thanks.
I didn't realize it's so arduous where you may need years sometimes to get a bill through.
Absolutely.
All the various committees. And I applaud you for getting so many bills
Thank you.
going just in the 3 short years that you have been in the legislature. So really quite impressive. Let me remind everyone again that if you have any questions, please jot them down on these cards. If you didn't pick up a card, Thomas, is there a way you can circulate more cards around the room? And then you have our student ambassadors standing on both sides of the room. Please hand them over to them. So I have a couple of questions already that I received from the floor. Let me ask you one. Now, I think you have addressed this already in your presentation. The questioner sort of submitted this a little bit before you probably talked about this, but here's the question. How would you feel that the relationships you have formed in the state assembly have helped you pass legislation?
Excellent. That's a great question. Did my mic go off? with coworkers, colleagues, classmates. Building relationships is a very valuable skill that I recommend that you employ daily because it will help you in the long run. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned the Assemblymember Rob Bonta. Rob Bonta from San Francisco. His view on California and my view on California are probably 180-degree differences in the way that we see things, but yet we get along very well as colleagues and as friends because we talk about what unites us, not what divides us. And I think that that is necessary, especially in this very polarized political climate that we have right now. But in Rancho Cucamonga, we have a company called Gerdau. Gerdau Steel is the last remaining steel mill in California. The last remaining steel mill in California. It actually sources all of the materials within a 400-mile radius locally, all recyclable. They bring all of like your old cars, old washing machines, old refrigerators. They bring them all together and they figure out what type of alloys and metals are in them and they melt them all down and they create their own billets of steel there. And then they turn those billets of steel into rebar for seismic retrofitting California's buildings. They even help build a lot of the structures that we're familiar with in downtown LA and some of the bridges that we're familiar with that California steel. Now, doing business in California is very difficult. I'm a business person. I could tell you all the challenges there are to do business in California. We have a lot of environmental restrictions on businesses. We have a lot of labor restrictions on businesses. We have a lot of just regulatory problems that anybody that chooses to do business in California has to learn how to overcome to stay in business in California. Wouldn't it make sense as California that we would incentivize using the companies that are from our state that have held to the standards that we ask them to hold to, as opposed to when we look to retrofit for seismic changes in our California-owned buildings, why would we import the steel from out of state or out of country when we would instead utilize the steel from a California-based company and support those 1,200 high-paying union jobs where they make between $80,000 to $120,000 a year? Why wouldn't we? Well, okay, let's ask that question. So I introduced a bill called Made in California. That was kind of a cool concept. Now, I recognize the limitations of being a Republican in California. I mean, there are limitations, and I recognize that. I don't want my steel mill to have a challenge that they cannot continue to do business in California because I carry that legislation. So I reached across the aisle to a colleague of mine, a Democrat colleague, and I said, hey, would you mind working with me and helping carry this legislation, meaning it's your bill. I'll come on as a co-author, but I'll do all the work with you and assist you to have those relationships, have those meetings, talk about the legislation, why it makes sense, and help work it through the legislative process. The first attempt, it was unsuccessful with my colleague, and my colleague unsuccessfully ran for re-election. So then I'm stuck. I'm looking at it going, okay, scratch my head. Let me think about this a little more. Now, when I was a young boy, my parents put me in judo. Now, has anybody had a chance to learn judo? The whole concept of judo is you take your opponent's weight and you use it against them, and you try and use volition and momentum to try and make sure that you're ultimately successful. So when you think about California, what do we care about in California? We care about the environment quite a bit, don't we? We care about pollution even more. We care about making sure that we have jobs that are good paying jobs. Hey, how can we blend a circumstance where we have good paying jobs without polluting the environment? That sounds like a winner. So I reached across the aisle to my good friend Rob Bonta, and we worked with the Sierra Club, a very, very pro-environment group that generally is not known for being pro-business. We worked together on both sides of the aisle to carry this legislation through to not only benefit this one particular steel mill, but we also then opened up the legislation and said, what are other materials that go inside of a building? And we understand that there's going to be glass, there's going to be insulation, there's going to be sheetrock. And we started looking at how can we hold those industries that are doing the best practices and give them the same benefit of allowing them to have an opportunity as far as priority and budgeting. And let me throw this one qualifier out there. This is a reference to all things being equal, meaning if I purchase the steel from Gerdau, I'm not going to pay more for the Gerdau steel than I am for the one that's imported, because that would make the cost of doing business to retrofit those buildings increase dramatically. But if your price Gerdau is the same as Turkey, I'm going to buy it from you. And then that helps California businesses. So I'm proud to say the governor signed that bill last year. And I forget what the name of it. I called it Made in California. Ultimately, we changed the name to Buy Clean California. And it was able to pass, and we were able to get bipartisan support. And I don't even think we had really any no votes when we went through the committees. Maybe a few on my side of the aisle, because I hadn't gotten to them. I camouflaged it a little too well.
Great. Well,
Anyway.
thank you so much. This is an interesting question. What is one thing you wish you knew before becoming an assembly member?
Oh, wow. Okay. I don't know. I could take a lot of different tacks on that, so I'm not really sure what would be the best
Just one
approach.
thing that you wish
right.
you knew.
Okay, so I didn't realize how challenging it would be on me physically. I think I wish I had known how difficult it would be. And let me put it in perspective. So for 9 months of the year, I get on a plane on Monday, and I come home on a plane on Thursday. And then when I arrive off the plane, I go straight to events until I'm done about 10:30 at night, each night. And then I still run my advertising agency. So on the weekends, I do events, and then I also run my company. So every morning, every day, every evening, every one of the days for those entire 4 years have been pretty much bell to bell 7 days a week. I didn't realize exactly what a toll it would take on me physically and mentally, because that's a very rigorous schedule for anybody to keep. I've enjoyed it. It's been a privilege and an honor to serve, but I did choose not to seek re-election because I really do want to be home. I've missed too much of my kids' lives. My daughter is graduating from high school this year, and she was 14 when I started this job. My son is 9, he's in 4th grade. He was 5. So I think if I had known exactly what that type of sacrifice was, maybe I might not have chosen.
Okay. Well, we are glad you didn't know that and you became an assembly member. Here are 2 questions that are somewhat similar, so I'm going to aggregate them. As you know, we have many students here who are public policy majors. We have both an undergraduate as well as a graduate program in public policy. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but Riverside is the only UC campus to have an undergraduate program in public policy. So you have a lot of aspiring political leaders here in this room today.
Excellent.
So here are the 2 questions. What skills and knowledge should I acquire now as a public policy student? And a related question is, what advice could you offer to a student who hopes one day to run for office?
Very good. Great questions. Okay, so for the first one, I already touched on relationships. Learning how to build relationships is absolutely essential for anybody that chooses to get into elected office. John Perez was speaker right before I was elected to the assembly, and he has amazing knowledge and really great advice and lots of great one-liners. And some of the best advice he had ever given me was, choose your enemies very carefully and have only one at any given time. That's a good piece of information, because in elected office, you're going to get bombs thrown at you from the left and from the right. And you have to realize that it's not you as a person. It has nothing to do with who you are. It has to do with what you represent or the territory that you currently inhabit. It's not you. So you've got to learn the old adage of develop that rhinoceros skin where it's very thick. It's hard to do. It's easier to say than it is to practice, especially when it seems like attacks can be very personal. But to the second part of the question, or the second question in the aggregate, is I would recommend go out there and become good at something else first before you go into public policy or wish to be an elected official. And let me explain why. It has been very difficult learning all of the issue areas that I have had to become an expert at in the short period of time that I've had to do it. There's not anybody in industry that if I went to, let's say I went into a manufacturers conference and there's 400 people in the room, if I said, could you tell me anybody that's been on the job for 4 years that you would consider to be an expert in your field, not a single hand would go up. But yet, in the elected capacity, we're expected to make decisions for your lives with very little understanding or exposure at some time to what the clear issues are. So what you have to do is you have got to train yourself to be a sponge to learn how to ask and answer questions. So my knowledge base for asking the right questions comes from 26 years of private sector experience. I understand when someone's trying to roll me. I understand when someone's trying to flatter me into just smiling and nodding. I understand all of those because I've lived it in a different capacity. So when I go into the public sphere and someone's telling me that my joke is better than I know it is, and that I'm taller than I know that I am, and I'm not as smart, all of those things, you have got to have that breadth of knowledge to pull from and the grounding so that you understand who you are as a person before you're in a position to go and make decisions for other people. And I think that that is absolutely critical and essential. And I still believe that there's a lot more I could have learned in the private sector even after 26 years before I went into the public sector. But I wanted to do this at a reasonable early age.
And of course, I would add that you have to have a passion for public service.
That's correct.
If you want to go into elected office.
Yes, yes. So I stated that in the beginning that my father being in the military instilled in my brother and I a very deep dedication to our community. When you move every 3 years, you learn how to make friends really quickly. We always joke, we make them quickly, we lose them even more quickly because their families get moved every 3 years too. But you learn to be able to build those relationships and then learn what's important and then have a passion for what you do. And you have to truly be passionate if you're going to work 7 days a week.
Great. Now, this is a question that's probably not quite in the policy areas in which you have worked in the legislature, but the question is, what is your opinion on the rising cost of higher education in California? And how can students participate in programs like the homeowner savings accounts that you mentioned when they are falling into major debt after attending college, and most of their income in the first few years after college has to be devoted to paying back their college loans?
Okay, so forgive me, I generally do try and dovetail that when I pitch the homeownership savings account about how young people are mired in debt. Because what we see now is when I came through UC Riverside, it was a very clear path for me to be able to receive my degree within a 4-year window. I did the 5-year route, but there's a very clear path to be able to do it in the 4-year window. And I understand now it could take upwards of 6 years because it's hard to be able to get the classes that you want. And the cost that's associated with that can be very difficult. I believe that the state has a responsibility to pick up a larger share of the cost of what it takes to run the UCs. When I was a student at the UCs, or when we look at the CSUs or even the community college, if we went back to the budgets back in the early 90s, you would see that the state of California was probably paying a larger percentage of the tuition for myself. I think for me, the entire year was $5,000. Just to put it in perspective, that didn't include books or living expenses. That was just for the units themselves. And a good amount of that was offset and subsidized by the state. And I know that on a regular basis in the governor's budget, we are seeing increases to the UC and the CSU systems, but it's not enough. And it's because we have a lot more students that are coming in. Our population has grown dramatically, but we need to increase capacity. Similar to homes, we need to build more. And I believe the best way for us to do it is to build more UCs, build more CSUs, build more community colleges, grow the universities that we currently have. And then for us in the Inland Empire, I'm going to be a little like self-serving here. When you think about it, we have one CSU, one UC, and a couple private universities within the Inland Empire. If you take the same square mileage or the same total population density in LA County, Orange County, San Diego County, Sacramento County, San Francisco County, they probably have twice the capacity, if not 3 times the capacity that we do here. we have got to reinvest, and the state has to reinvest. Because right now what we're doing is we're putting the burden on your shoulders, or if your parents are generous enough to assist you, we're taking it away from their retirement. So you're either getting it in the form of debt, or you're getting it in the form of your parents sacrificing retirement that they have saved for themselves, which will ultimately be a cost to the state down the road as well. It's just shifting the money around. So I believe that the state has a responsibility to cover more of those costs. And I vote every single time to increase the funding to UCs and to the CSUs. I have every single time.
Great, thank you. Here's one other question. You described the long and arduous process for getting a new legislation passed. But what is the process to get an existing legislation removed? Is it equally difficult or even more difficult?
I honestly always joke, I think for every piece of legislation we introduce, you should repeal 5, right? Because, I mean, think about it. I gave you guys perspective, 4,500 pieces of legislation this year alone. The problem is I think it's the inherent nature of ball scores that we see coming out of newspapers or publications. You know, for me to be deemed an effective legislator, a lot of time people go, well, how many bills did you have signed into law? So it's a ball score. So I am incentivized to come up with reasons for legislation. Even if it's a matter of dotting an I or crossing a T or changing one line of code, if I can get that legislation through the process and signed by the governor, bing, another one in my ball score. I think what would be a great ball score is how many really bad pieces of legislation did I help kill? I think that's a great ball score because there are some horrible ideas in Sacramento that are being kicked around as being, hey, let's go do that. For example, every single year for the last 3 years, there's been an introduction of an increase in our sales tax to cover services. Now, right now you pay sales tax on products, goods that you purchase. Not all of them, but most of them. Food is kind of left alone, but there's a whole lot of them that you pay sales tax. Imagine if you had to expand the amount of sales tax to every service that you employ. Think about it. I'll make a simple one. You go get a haircut, there you go. You get your nails done, there you go. You go to a CPA, there you go. You go to an attorney? You want to add sales tax to an attorney? Holy moly, there you go. Start thinking of every single service that we currently pay for that does not have sales tax applicable. That could be very, very frightening. We have been successful in stopping that legislation currently. They're going to continue to try and press it forward. The state looks at it as potentially generating $80 billion more in revenue for the state. Now, when the state says more revenue for the state, it means it's coming out of the private sector, which means it's money that's not available for you to earn and not available for your family to earn, not available for us to use towards the transference of goods and services. So that's legislation that we've been trying to kill. I have yet to see a way for us to roll back legislation, except for one example where we were able to go in and reform bad legislation, and that is very rare to have that occur. But I'm very proud of one reform package that we're able to get through, and hopefully down the road we'll still have some more before the end of this session.
Thank you. Excuse me? Could you please write your question? We really are doing it this way, so if you could write your question on a card and send it forward, I would appreciate it. Thank you. One question, and since we have a few questions here, we'll go through this process.
Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about your involvement in the New Wave movement? And why did you become involved in that movement, and why is it important? Maybe for those of the audience who are not familiar with the New Wave movement, you could explain what it is.
Okay, so, all right, so we have a two-party system in California right now. We have Republicans and we have Democrats. Now, I believe that a single-party control leads itself to abuse. And I believe that on the state side, with one party in control of all aspects of government, and I believe it on the federal side, where one party, the opposite party, is in control of all aspects of government. So I am intellectually honest in my position that I don't believe one-party control is good for public policy. I believe the best way is to have a balance of power and to be able to have an exchange of ideas and opinions in a way that we're not completely demonizing the other side. And I am in a party right now that is in the super minority in California, and a lot of it has to do with the polarization. A lot of people think that Republicans are just plain evil, or that they're mean-spirited, or that the policies that they support are meant to hurt people intentionally. I will tell you that's not the case. I believe in limited government. There's a role for government, but when government takes that role, it should do it in a very efficient and very frank way. I believe that individual responsibility is a necessity. I think we should all be responsible for our own actions. I believe in some of those major foundations of the Republican platform. What is interesting is when we look at Republicans' ideas and you throw away the R next to the name, the ideas work because people agree with the ideas. When you put the R next to it, you're blinded by the R and you ignore the idea because you think that person is not a good person or maybe has malevolence in their heart. When you look at local government, where there are no R's or D's next to their names, 76% of California's local offices are held by Republicans. Wow. 76% in a state that we're in the super minority when it comes to partisan politics. So the New Way movement is for us to try and say, hey, we've got to get away from this type of an environment. On the Democrat side, they have what they call moderate Democrats. And they have put together their own coalition, Mod Dems, and they work together to try and offset the progressives on legislation in Sacramento. On the Republican side, we need to have a new way, so when we speak to voters about the issues that voters care about, if we just change a few words in the way that we describe the issue, in polling we find that our numbers skyrocket by upwards of 18 to 22% higher among likely voters, and especially among young people. So the New Way movement is to say we are not going to walk away from our fundamental beliefs, but we're going to speak about them in a way that doesn't make you feel like we're saying we don't want you to enjoy and share the common beliefs that we have. We want to be more inclusive, more inviting. We want to make sure that people understand that the idea is what we're trying to sell, and we want everybody to be a participant. So we've been trying to bring in all different stakeholders and groups and say, help us shape it so that we can rebuild the California Republican brand. Because in California, the Republican brand is completely different than what you see outside of California. In fact, I would argue a California Republican is very similar to a lot of the rest of the country's Democrats.
Yes. Thank you. I didn't know that 76% of the...
yeah, it's a big number.
That is a huge
number. It does
number.
change every election.
Right,
so,
but,
it may be a little stale after the most recent election, but the last number I heard was 76%.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
What is your opinion on the top two primary system? And do you believe that it is somewhat, this issue is, I don't see what the author meant by this, but if you believe that it's somewhat similar to gerrymandering.
Oh, yeah, gerrymandering. Okay, so, all right, so the top two primary system was, it was a Republican idea that was promoted by Republicans to try and really bring out the more moderate members. In a closed primary system, the way it used to work is you would have a Republican ticket and a Democrat ticket. And you would find that anybody running for those offices would run to the very far right or the very far left. And they would throw bombs in the middle. And yet, as I've been saying, 80%, 85% we can all agree on is in that middle ground. So how do we bring us all back to the middle? Well, by having an open primary structure where the top two vote getters move on to the general election, it allows people to be a little more moderate in the way they approach things, because you want to reach out to that third party that I haven't mentioned, the no party preference, which pretty soon there's going to be more registered no party preference than there are people registered as Republican. It's that close. Like literally, I think they're like 3 points apart right now. So by bringing a more moderated approach, we're hoping we will end up with a better outcome in who we elect, so we don't have extremists on either side. because honestly, the bomb throwing doesn't benefit any of us. It just galvanizes and polarizes, and it makes it more difficult for us to get policy through. So I would say I'm in support of it. I understand that there's a lot of people on both parties that are frustrated with the two-party system, the top two primary, because it can be gamed a little bit. And when we look at statewide offices, Republicans are very frustrated because they've been unsuccessful in advancing a candidate to any of the statewide elections, or statewide elections for statewide offices.
If this is not being too personal, would you describe some daily routines or habits that you have pursued to develop your leadership skills and qualities?
Thank you. I read a lot. Like literally read a lot, as much as I possibly can. And it isn't always just the news articles. It's trying to keep myself as well versed on the topics that are out there, and then also start thinking about bigger picture ideas. On a daily basis, I'm pretty routine. It's probably from the military upbringing. I try to wake up the same time. The weirdest part about living in Sacramento and living here is I never remember where I am when I wake up, so that's kind of a little disconcerting, like where's the bathroom, I mean, little things like that are a little odd, like where am I right now? So, but I wake up, I try to have a regular routine so I can at least feel like comfortable, stable, and then I have my business that I run, as I've stated, so I'll go in, I'll log into my network. I'll make sure that everybody last night did their job. I'll go to Sacramento, to the Capitol office, work with the staff, make sure I get everything accomplished there. They have a series of meetings for me, as I stated, very regularly. We'll have people that will fly up to Sacramento to advocate on their particular issues. We call that legislation day. So we'll have all of those meetings. And then there's days where I have to go onto the floor of the assembly and I have to vote, and then of course attend committees. Then when that is over, then there's a whole series of events in the evenings that you're supposed to attend. Now this is kind of crazy. So there may be 4, 5, 6, up to 10 events any given evening. And the idea is I'm supposed to show up, greet people, pat them on the back, shake hands, hug, all those things, and then move on to the next event, the next event, the next event. I may be done by 8, 8:30, 9 o'clock. I generally try never to stay out past that late. Nothing good happens after 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So it's better to get back, and then I'll log back into my computer and I'll work on what needs to be done, prepare for the next day's committees, presentations, and do it all over again. And then when I come home, my district staff will have a whole series of events, organizations, opportunities for me to interact with the community. And there's a whole lot of kissing babies, hugging people, the works, and you do that throughout the entire weekend. And then you go back and you get back on a plane, you do it all over again. It's kind of like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, and then on Friday evenings, you are called to speak to UCR students.
Oh, no, this is my favorite. You guys have no idea how flattered I was to be invited. I think I kind of bugged you a lot, like, hey, why haven't I been invited? Hint, hint. But, it's like I never once in my wildest dreams when I was a student here ever thought that I would be given the greatest opportunity to serve in the state assembly. I mean, really, I never believed that that was something that was in the cards for me. I was just going to be a private sector person. I had dreams and aspirations, but I got caught up in life. And when you get caught up in life, sometimes you lose track of what those aspirations are until you take stock and you go back and take another look and say, well, what do I want to do next? And so it's been a tremendous ride for me to do this experience and this job. And I'm just grateful for all the constituents in the 40th Assembly District for giving me this privilege.
And I guess we should, you'll probably agree with me that we are lucky in California to have people from all walks of life, whether they are school teachers, businessmen, who have gone on and served in elected capacity in the state legislature.
That's correct. I would say that I believe diversity is one of our greatest strengths. And it's a diversity of all of our common experiences and then all of our individual experiences shared together. And when we work together back to the relationships, I have learned so much from individuals in a very casual atmosphere than I ever imagined I would. And it's something that I feel much richer for having had that experience.
So here's a very broad question. How will you work to stop California from taking on too much debt and curb wasteful spending?
Okay, that's a good question. All right, so, well, California is All right, so I'm going to get a little dreary in answering this because I'm going to take that question and answer it a little bit differently. All right, so California is in kind of an unusual predicament in the way that we generate the revenue that goes into our general fund. A lot of states receive their income from property taxes or from sales taxes. California is detrimentally reliant on personal income taxes for the majority of our finances. All right, so we're a state of 40 million people, 40 million. 146,000 individuals pay 51% of our state's budget.
Wow.
146,000, that's it. That is less than the size of some of these small cities adjacent to Riverside. That one city is paying for the entirety of most of California's expenses. That worries me because when we see a fluctuation in the stock market, if you remember March of 2009, our stock market was at 6,500. Right now we're at 24, 25, 26,000. I don't even know right now, I haven't looked. But we are very, very affluent right now in the state of California, being the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world because of the benefit of Silicon Valley, because of the benefit of a lot of the industries in California where we have people that are able to create wealth. If those people choose to leave the state of California, we will lose all of that wealth and we will have to backfill those. Let me give you an example. If you take one Silicon Valley entrepreneur, for any one of those individuals that decides to leave California, it probably takes 10,000 middle-class jobs to backfill the amount of taxes that person paid into the general fund. We're not generating those jobs anywhere near as quickly as we need to. So we need to come up with a different way that we can come up with a process that gives us more stability to the funding mechanisms of the state. What that is yet, I don't know. I don't know if it's a statewide sales tax and we bring down the individual income tax. I'm not sure what is the right way to balance that out. But there needs to be a way for us to actually create a more stable environment so that we have the funding going forward so we can all enjoy the prosperous California that you see today.
Okay, here's a timely question. What is your opinion on the current tax rate for recreational marijuana in California?
Oh, I don't even know
Do you
what it is.
believe that decreasing that tax rate will benefit the state by stimulating more legal sales?
Yeah, okay, so that's a supply and demand question as well. And yes, if you reduce the cost, then sure, you possibly would have an increase in the legalized. But this was one of my concerns originally when the proposition was put on the ballot. And so just so you know, a little background, I am not for the proposition. I voted against the proposition. I don't believe that marijuana or cannabis, as it's referred to in the state, that cannabis is necessarily a positive. And I don't believe that taxing cannabis and looking towards it to try and solve or maybe fill in holes in our statewide budget is going to be successful for the very reason that we're seeing that it's proven to be unsuccessful right now. The majority of the people that were growing in California, what they call the Golden Triangle, the 3 or 4 counties up in the Humboldt area, right before it became a legal process, they were growing illegally. They were growing as, I like to use the reference, they're criminals and they're doing something that's illegal, so they're pirates, okay? So I'm just going to call them pirates. When Proposition 65, what? 64. When 64, there's just too many propositions. There were 19 that year. But when Proposition 64 went into effect, one of my biggest concerns were, how in the world are we going to incentivize all of these individual farms that are out there right now growing illegally to come out from the shadows and get a license from the Department of Cannabis and say, I now want to be a merchant instead of a pirate? Because when they've spent generations as pirates, it's very hard to come out of the shadows and say, I now want to be taxed. And it's a $7 billion a year industry that's completely cash. Now, I've already stated I was against it. But when the voters approved it, my responsibility as a legislator is to make it work, is to make it safe, is to make sure that it's not dangerous to children, to be able to put in the rules with the Department of Cannabis so that this new law that's been passed by the voters with the will of the voters is implemented in a way, in the safest way possible. And there's a couple fears that I have. One, a whole lot of people are going to want to stay pirates. And that's the problem right now. The taxation's too high, and they're using that as a justification, as pretense to stay outside of the legal framework, but yet the framework is allowing the infrastructure for the legal sales to occur. And so the pirates are using the legal sales framework for them to sell their illegal product because it's not licensed by the state. The Department of Cannabis department director, her name is Lori Ajax, she and I worked together closely on putting together some of the rules and regs. There's a company in Rancho Cucamonga, of which I was a city council member and I represent. I had to learn all of this drinking from that fire hose, but when you create an edible, you're using a thing called honey oil to be able to put the THC into that product. If you let that honey oil bake and you crack it, you can then create a product called shatter. So both of those products are derivatives of what they call the trim from the marijuana plant. That is not the flower that is used, that is ingested through smoking. The rest of the trim has THC held onto all of it as the molecules. So what they do is they created a machine that will take these propane-sized tanks with butane in them, fill a tube with all of the trim. They will then run the butane through the tank, bring all of the THC down, then the butane will evaporate into the ground and it'll leave into the tray the honey oil, and however long you leave it in the tray will determine if it stays honey oil, if it becomes shatter. But one of the secondary conflicts is butane is heavier than air, and it blows up really, really easily by just the slightest spark. Your pants rubbing together will spark an explosion. So it was brought to my attention by my San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies that we had a lot of these homes that were doing it illegally because you could purchase this product through the internet. You can go into the storefront. There were no laws preventing you from purchasing this machine, and they were blowing up homes, and there was one that happened in Hesperia adjacent to a school. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants a home blowing up in a neighborhood near a school. So we introduced legislation successfully to say that anyone that uses this machine needs to have a license to use that machine and a certain type of license at that. And it can only be used in a manufacturing area, not in a mixed-use area, not in a residential area. And the Department of Cannabis took our legislation and incorporated those rules into their guidelines for how they go out there right now. So the Department of Cannabis is using our language for their own rules and regulations and how they move this along. But one of my concerns when I met with the director was, you're going to start tracking all of these marijuana plants, and you think that right now the cost per pound of marijuana was $1,200 in California, but in New Jersey it's $6,500. So why in the world would you want to sell it for $1,200? I asked this question. Why would you want to sell it for $1,200 and have to pay all the fees and the taxes that go along with it when you can stay a pirate and take it to New Jersey and get 6 times the cost? Well, we're dealing with that unforeseen and unfortunate circumstance now. Colorado and Washington State went through similar circumstances, and I believe that they did reduce taxes ultimately to try and bring more people into the mainstream. I think it's still a work in progress.
Well, on that note, I'm going to bring tonight's event to a close, but before you pack up, I want to urge you to stick around because we have lots of food left outside. If you don't consume it, it's going to be thrown away.
I'm going to eat it.
So stick around, and Assemblymember Steinorth will be here to mingle with you. We still have 15 minutes or so in our program, but let me now thank the Assemblymember for a brilliant and a very helpful, informative presentation and answering our questions. I think it has helped me understand how difficult your job is and how well you have been doing it. We are very lucky here to have a representative like you in Sacramento.
You're very kind.
Thank you so
very much. Thank you for having me here. It's been a great honor. Thank you.